Welcome to Intro to Next Gen Data Center. Today is Wednesday, April the 8th, 2015. My name is Alex Souza, co-chair of the Intro to Meetup, along with my good friend and colleague, Mr. Pamiti. Before we go any further, I wanted to thank Cisco for use of this great venue and for catering the event. Let's give them a big hand. Our speaker today is Shashi Kiran, the Senior Director, Marketing Management for Data Center Cloud and Open Networking at Cisco. Shashi oversees the global market management for products and solutions across Cisco's multi-billion-dollar data center, cloud, and open networking portfolios. Shashi has been involved in contributing to standards bodies primarily in security and frequently speaks at industry events on a diverse range of technology areas.
First of all, thanks to you for making the trek over to the Cisco campus here. How many of you are on the Cisco campus for the first time? Okay, welcome. And for those of you who have been here before, welcome back. On behalf of Cisco, I'd like to thank you all for making the trek here on a weekday. And what we were looking at sharing with you is how we see some of the data center technologies and the space in particular evolve over the next few years. This has been one of the most exciting space for us here at Cisco. It's one of the more dynamic portfolios that we have, and it's an incredibly exciting time for us here in the industry because it's going through a phenomenal amount of change. So what I'm going to maybe share with you over the next little while is some of the thoughts that we bring in front of our customers, and I'm going to keep it fairly high level because this is supposed to be a technology topic for non-technical audiences. And then based on the questions, we can go deeper into some of these topics as you see fit. I have a few people from the team who are a lot smarter than I am, and they'd be in a position to help answer with some of the questions as well. Harry, Sandeep, these are all experts in the data center space, as also Klaus. So we'll come to that in the next little while. Yeah, good? Okay. So first of all, regardless of whether you're in the data center or you're monitoring technology outside from a business perspective, what you can all really look at is let me see if I can get it to project. Okay, that's better. So what you can all relate to is really the pace at which things have been changing. I saw this cartoon where there's this kid coming in front of the television and he's trying to swipe the screen because kids today have grown up with screens that they can swipe. You give your iPhone to a 2-year-old, they master the technology in a few minutes. And so that is the pace of change that technology is having to deal with. When you look at it in the context of a digital enterprise, which is what we're all looking at our customers transition into, the pace of change has been really accelerating. And especially over the last several years, we have seen a number of industries, well-established industries, that have gone through very, very accelerated transitions. So you look at retail, which went through this brick to click, right? So and then you started to look at transport. If some of you are using Uber, Uber's completely disrupted the traditional taxi and transport industry. Likewise, you look at music, what Apple did originally with the industry, and now you have a number of players. Square, if you're familiar with it, it's revolutionizing point of sale terminals. And same with digital signage and advertising. So it's very ironic that if you look at some of these industries, you have Uber becoming a very proliferant transport provider, but guess what? They don't have any inventory of cars, right? You look at somebody like Alibaba in China, they are one of the largest retailers on the planet. But guess what? They're not having any inventory. So suddenly you're seeing these transitions happen where businesses can come online, command huge market share, huge traction, but it's not the old way of doing business. So the point here is what is enabling this is really technology, right? If you strip it out, it's really technology that's fostering innovation, and on the other hand, it's also causing disruption. So that's the two sides of the coin that you see here, because if these businesses are in a position to go keep pace with change, then they're able to survive and thrive. If not, you go down the route of blockbusters or Borders who weren't really in a position to make that technology transition, right? So if you look at all of these things, what's happening here? How does it relate to the data center? So today we're seeing that the data center as well as the cloud, depending on how people start to relate the two, is really at the heart of this business transformation. A lot of companies are looking into how do they optimize the data center strategy, and if they can get it right, then it obviously helps fuel how quickly they can make the transition happen. If their data center and cloud strategy is chaotic, it has a huge ripple effect in terms of how impactful their IT organization is, right? So if you look at some of the data points, we're continuing to see a phenomenal growth in terms of the traffic. We're also looking at volume growing in terms of people uploading, whether it's the consumer-led uploads or whether it's the enterprise backup, data proliferation is increasing exponentially. And then the sheer number of devices, I mean, all of us are carrying smartphones. On an average, every smartphone is having 25 to 30 applications. Each one of those applications is polling some data center or cloud in real time, depending on how many you have active. And so what this has resulted is almost 1 trillion transactions on a daily basis aggregated across data centers. So it's a huge focus area for many CIOs in the industry, and that's where a lot of their budgets lie. But if you look at how data centers were traditionally, right, this whole movement around data centers started to happen in the last decade and a half, 2 decades ago. And the notion there was, look, we have so many pockets of IT across all of our organization, and so we need to staff each one of these places. We have infrastructure deployed everywhere. Why don't we consolidate all of these things into a centralized location? Why don't we provide really fast access to it that's that complemented with the growth of internet, and then keep our best IT staff there, the guys that are the most trained, that can manage this infrastructure. So the traditional data center was really focused on bringing things together into a centralized location, having your best people look at it, having perimeter security around it, and really looking at the economies of scale, because you are in a position to scale that infrastructure. So I'm not sure if it is this door. It may be an external exit, external door that somebody is not closed. Anyway, okay, thank you. All right. So you know we take security seriously here at Cisco, right? you can come in, but you can't leave now. So it's like Hotel California. You can check in anytime, but you can never leave. Okay. So what we're saying is that was the notion of the traditional data center. But if you split these two words, data center, it was really to get data centralized and be in a position to manage data. And the whole purpose why data centers existed was to service the needs of applications, right? And it was manageable because you had monolithic applications that were sort of centralized, Outlooks, Exchange, things like that. What's happening today? Today, we have watches that can start to monitor your health diagnostics, and they're all correlating to things that you have in the cloud. So the healthcare industry in the United States, for example, which was predicated on really the cure and less prevention is now shifting because there are a number of real-time diagnostics available in our Fitbits as well as watches that are communicating real time. So you can see what is your pulse rate, whether you're sleeping properly, what is the heart rate. So all of these things are causing a huge amount of data to now reside in the edge. Same thing with transport, with retail, point of sale terminal. So each of these is generating data. Each of these has an application experience associated with it. And guess what? All of this does not necessarily reside on your endpoint. There is a correlation that's happening to something in the data center or cloud. So the traditional boundary of data center is blurring and going to where the points of data and application are. So what are the challenges this poses? So on one hand, there are the technology disruptions that we talked about. On the other hand, there are the operational aspects of it, because you have this social, media, social and analytical, as well as cloud. So we call this the SMAC, right? So SMAC is definitely causing this. Incredible amount of data is coming in, which we call as big data, because on one hand you need to handle the data. On the other hand, you need to analyze it, because if you can analyze it and you derive intelligence out of it, you're in a better position to drive business decisions. So that's where this humongous amount of data, the processing, the analytics, and the ability to deal with it in real time is what is driving the whole big data analytics movement. So IT has to deal with all of that on one hand, and on the other hand, there are the organizational issues. Typically, when data centers were set up, there was a network team, there was a compute team, there was a storage team, there was an application team. Each one of them had their mandates, and often they weren't necessarily talking to each other, or the processes weren't streamlined, or the technology was not streamlined. So there are these organizational challenges that came about. And so on one hand, IT became a bit of a bottleneck. When a new request came in, it had to go through a several multi-step hop process, which delayed when a new application could be stood up. And so IT sort of became a bit of a bottleneck. And what happened was a number of organizations, whether it's marketing, HR, sales, they started going down the path of public cloud and saying, look, if our internal IT is a bottleneck, let me just go and get that stuff done. Let's get something going in a public cloud environment or some other way we will do. We just need to get stuff done fast, right? So that created the notion of shadow IT, which was somebody else doing what was IT's work. So we've had some data points where almost 40 to 60% of IT budget actually is spent outside of the IT organization. And it is not just a financial issue, because IT is also expected to govern. They're expected to ensure that the security is there, the compliance aspects are managed. And when other organizations that are not aware of these aspects start to indulge in IT activities and IT tasks, they end up bypassing many of these governance mechanisms. So, for example, Box is a great sharing tool, but if the security controls are not properly implemented by somebody who is unaware, they could seriously have compliance issues. They could inadvertently give out company restricted information outside. So these are all some of the issues that are coming in. And then build versus buy. What do companies build internally versus outsource from somewhere else? And the whole aspect here is, from an application perspective, if you're not in a position to go roll that application out quickly, then you're not in a position to respond to change. And guess what? You're unable to meet that pace of change there. So that's where IT was at a bit of a crossroads with some of the data center activity, because that's where it's hugely concentrated. And there's the challenge with the line of business that we need to really come into. So the question is, how can this data center enable fast IT, right? How can you adapt to the pace of change? For this, as with anything else, we're looking to see how do you shift from being in a maintain mode, because every day there's so much tactical stuff to maintain. IT is not in a position to respond to change. So how do you shift the focus from being in maintenance to focusing on innovation? Because you can only transform when you have the cycles and the resources to innovate. The second thing is really shifting the focus from technology outcomes to something that's more business outcome led, where you're partnering truly with the business stakeholders. The third is a shift in mindset to a certain extent, where previously the mandate for IT was, hey, this infrastructure needs to be stood up, this application needs to get rolled out, go build it in the most reliable manner, and it's going to last. So that built to last mentality brought in a lot of rigidity, whereas what's the need of the day is not just built to last, which is important, but also the ability to change. How quickly can you respond to a business needs? So to do that, if you look at the operational model, typically almost 70% of the IT resources is in the operation cycle, budget, staffing, and there is about 20% that's focused on new things, growth aspects, and 10% or even lesser is spent on transformative activities which can address new business models. And for most organizations to succeed, the mix needs to radically change. Okay, so the operate piece needs to become significantly smaller than growth activities, and then a significant amount of cycles need to be freed up to innovate and transform. Otherwise, they're not in a position to catch market transitions. So here is where we talk about in terms of where we are in the journey. In the last 10, 15, 20 years, as I said, most organizations took the opportunity to consolidate their data centers from all the distributed locations they had, and then made the edges lighter. And then what happened, they realized as they brought in this capacity into the data center environments, they saw that they had these servers, and each of the servers had maybe one application running on it. They said, okay, we have excess capacity. How do I get economies of efficiency here, get more out of the server capacity I'm investing in? So that's when virtualization started to take root, and this was or be a little more. And the whole period went through a process of optimization. How do you optimize the capacity that you have after you consolidated it? Now, virtualization brought in several benefits. For example, you could take the same server, have multiple applications, workloads running on it. So you got more out of less. So you did save on CapEx. You didn't need to have server after server invested. But what happened after a while, these virtual machines started to move. Okay, so they needed to be going from one server location to another, one rack to another. And as the virtual machines proliferated, the need to manage them also started to increase, because now you have to track where these were and ensure that the application SLAs were met. And that caused this huge amount of management complexity, where from the period of efficiency, we started moving into how do you manage this complexity. So today, if you look at where we are in terms of data center, it's really focused on speed and simplicity. How quickly can you bring things together? How simple can you make it operationally? And this is the inflection point that we need to get past very quickly. So we're focusing on automation, right? So if you look at the cloud journey, we break it into 4 phases: the consolidation phase, the virtualization phase, automation, and then you get into the cloud nirvana, if you will, right? So we are in this phase of automation where there's a shift moving from manual to automated. There's a shift moving from siloed operations to something that's more streamlined. And if you get past this, that is where we're saying, look, truly the vision of IT, if it is to deliver things as a service, where they don't need to stand up infrastructure every time, where they're not bottlenecks. Anytime somebody asks for something, you have this resource pool available that is dynamically allocated on demand. So that's the notion of IT as a service. And to get to that, that is when we need to get past automation into a land where you can reconcile what's in the data center or somewhere in the edge, tied to Internet of Things or tied to your smartphones or the cloud. So it really becomes a very fluid environment there. So that's the shift that we're currently underneath. And if you start to sort of look at the future to a certain extent, what's the analogy that you can derive here, right? In some ways, IT is a fairly young industry. We've been looking at all these practices for about 20, 30 years, right? But if you look at some of the other parallel industries, for example, manufacturing, almost 100 years ago, when cars were being manufactured, most companies that were manufacturing cars were bringing in parts, building a lot of it together. It was a very manual way of assembling, building, and the turnout that they had was pretty low. The volume of cars that got churned was very low. And at the same time, the quality was not very predictable, because one day a worker came in, another day, he went out, somebody else came in with a different skill set, and the output was, different. Then what happened? Then the assembly line came in, that got invented. And the second thing that happened is they realized, yes, we don't need to manufacture all the parts ourselves. We can go source these from different vendors. So that aspect of sourcing flexibility started to come in. And then Henry Ford came in and said, let's automate this. And they were in a position to churn cars out every 3 minutes. And the cars were very predictable. The quality was great. Only problem was the paint wasn't drying as fast as the cars were getting manufactured. The only paint that was drying fast enough was a type of black. So Ford said, you can have any color you want as long as it's black, right? So the key thing there is it went through a process in terms of being able to bring in components based on where they could source it the fastest with the best quality, and get into these agreements and quickly start to put together an assembly line format, which is the automation phase. So in some way, if you look at what's happening today, it's the same thing that we're going through. In the IT shop, there was a significant amount of focus on customizing, building things in-house. What's happening in the data center environments today is bring the best pieces from wherever you can. Open source is there. Let's adopt open source, some efforts that are community-led. And guess what? We will take things that are of value to us and then really start building things out very rapidly. And that's where the automation piece kicks in. So that's the phase we're going through in the data center and cloud, where the cloud is becoming a supply chain, right? So it doesn't matter. It could be a Microsoft cloud, a Google cloud, a Facebook cloud. Depending on what service you want, you should be in a position to go get it, or your own enterprise private cloud. So it's sort of becoming a supply chain of sorts, where you can source it, you can bring it, assemble it, automate it at scale. And that's being reflected here as we look forward over the next few years, that almost 78% of these workloads, which is network compute and storage coming in, are going to be in these cloud data centers. And cloud here is, it could be a combination of private, public, or a hybrid cloud environment. And then infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or even software as a service. So we're looking at a number of those going down the path of software as a service workloads. And then public cloud is definitely seeing a fair amount of adoption. Now the key thing is a majority of the traffic that we see is sort of within the data center. All this Internet of Things, all the edge traffic, that's driving about 17%, but nearly 78% of the traffic is within the data center. And that is where there's a lot of focus on how do you optimize this infrastructure, how do you take care of this traffic, the workload requirements, application requirements. So the strategy that we have evolved is really to look at a policy-based automation approach. Okay, so here, as I said, automation is very key to making this transition happen. But at the same time, one is focusing on the data center. I'll talk about the importance of policy in a moment. But we're looking at this policy-driven infrastructure approach to give that high degree of automation. It also is fairly open, because we want to integrate not just with our products, but products from other vendors in the industry, open source efforts, things like that. At the same time, you cannot compromise on security. And I talked about the different organizational groups within data center. How do you make things operationally simple for them, respond to change? The second thing is the data center is one location. As I said, the boundaries are blurring. if your workload needs to exist in a public cloud environment, let's say you upload everything into a public cloud, you lose visibility. Typically, when something is in a public cloud, you don't know how it is getting handled there. You don't know what kind of security is in there, and you don't know how if you want to retrieve it. Many times there are issues. So typically in most organizations there are certain set of applications that they're comfortable with putting into a public cloud environment. But there are others, whether it is for compliance or security reasons, or for the fact that they need more predictable access, they want it on premise. Now the true nirvana is when you have that flexibility to go across different cloud providers and on your on premise, and be in a position to still give that predictable application experience. So the second part of the strategy is to really ensure that it really shouldn't matter where it is. Your application could be on premise, in the cloud. It should be really suitable for that flexible consumption model. And the third is, we talked about all these devices really driving that correlation with the data center and cloud. On one hand, we have, let's say, 100 of these watches that warrant standing up a server in the data center. There is a capacity requirement that these drive. On the other hand, let's say you walk into a shopping retail environment as a shopper, and the application senses your location, and it's in a position to identify who you are based on you having opted into a shopping list before, and then it serves you a promotion saying, hey, you shopped for this suit last time, we have something on sale right now, and it comes on your mobile phone, right? And you say, okay, let me do a price comparison. You do a price comparison, and then you decide to make the purchase there. Or it recognizes you based on your presence. A concierge comes in and gives you the special treatment. So these are all the things that facilitate the new business models, the customer experience that comes in from tying something that's in your hand with something that's in the data center or cloud. So this is where we're looking at this correlation happening with what's in the data center, making it very automated with the policy approach, but also having that seamless transition between the cloud and the edge. And obviously this needs to be facilitated with an open architecture. I'll talk a little bit about policy. So policy is a word that's used by different people in different ways. Here we're looking at it as a definition that somebody in the IT organization can bring in and link to how the infrastructure needs to behave, whether it's a compute infrastructure, network infrastructure, integrated solutions, or the cloud. And then this policy really needs to be linked to business requirements, because eventually these applications are a byproduct of what the business requires. And the basic premise here is, if you can make your infrastructure more responsive to the needs of applications, then there's a better opportunity to deliver business outcomes. So that's where we're looking at policy as, on one hand, taking what the application requires and interpreting it to the needs of infrastructure, because these are two different languages. It's almost like a Google translator that is saying, look, here is the application guy speak. He doesn't want to be concerned with how you configure things or how you connect things. He's going to say, here is what the application needs to do. And then you need to translate it into the language of a network server or a security person. And that's where the power of it really comes to play, when you can decouple this infrastructure requirements from the policy and the applications. So that's the approach that we have taken very successfully with our compute portfolio. We brought that into this SDN conversations with our application-centric infrastructure. In some ways, it's like the SIM card that you have on your mobile phones, right? So you can have any cell phone that you want. You can take your SIM card, pop it from one and place it into another, and your identity is still in the new cell phone, and your contact information, your profiles, all of that is ported over. But now you get to leverage the power of that other infrastructure, and that infrastructure may come in with its own set of benefits. So this is where we're looking at the notion of stateless infrastructure, and it's picked up pretty big with our customers, that we're extending it in terms of what began with the server originally into the network, and carrying both the identity as well as the servers. How does it help? So it helps, as I said, if you want to roll out applications, typically it's several weeks, sometimes even months, depending on the complexity of the applications, how many people within the organization need to sign off on it or have something to do with it. So typically we're looking at it being multi-weeks, and this common policy framework allows people to collaborate better, and the process handling becomes a lot smoother. At the same time, the application rollout, the automation aspects further speed up the rollout. And then what happens when something goes wrong? So who owns the trouble ticket? Who's the person who needs to fix it? Very often that's the big challenge that organizations run into in the data center, saying where is the problem? So having that visibility helps to troubleshoot, and we're trying to bring all of these three things together. So it's not just rolling out a new application, but being in a position to debug, troubleshoot it, so when something goes wrong, you're in a position to rectify it immediately. And all of this needs to be obviously built not just for bringing your own products together, but where it interoperates with what other people have in the industry. And what you'll realize is no data center is an island, and no data center is built on a single vendor's infrastructure and or application. So you'll see that they represent really the diversity that you see in humanity to a certain extent in terms of the heterogeneity of infrastructure. Typically, there are open standards that are driven by standards organization, but also open source. So today, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a number of open source communities that have stepped up and said, hey, we will tackle this aspect of the problem, because nobody wants to treat these infrastructure components in silos. They want to treat it as a stack and have it be consumable. And so you've seen a proliferation of software tools, open source community elements that are looking at how do you automate it, how do you treat it as a consumable stack, orchestrate it. So these are some of the initiatives that we are actively leading or participating in. And then the third aspect is the open interfaces. So the analogy there is if you're exposed to an Apple iPhone, the iPhone iOS really is open for developers to build applications. So that's one way of doing it. Or it could be Google Android, which is looking at an open source operating system where people come in and say, look, I'm going to build to the Android operating system. So there are different models in which open source can be brought in, or open interfaces can be exposed, even though the underlying infrastructure is not necessarily open source. And the third piece is, as I mentioned, there's no single vendor that can do this together. And once we start opening our infrastructure up, we start bringing in and integrating with other vendors in the industry. And from a customer perspective, they look at this multiplicity of vendors coming together, jointly innovating, and that eases the consumability of the solution. So we're focusing on this open ecosystem. UCS is our compute portfolio. It's industry leading blade servers, fastest ramp up in server history in a way. ACI is our SDN solution. It does a lot more than the traditional aspects of what you see as SDN in the industry. It's application-centric infrastructure, right? So that's what I talked about. And intercloud is our strategy in terms of how you take your private cloud environment, public cloud environment, and give that ease of use. So what we typically see is, most organizations, they want their on-premise private cloud or data centers where they want to control things, they want to have visibility into things, they want their IT staff to manage it. And then there are some applications, as I said, that can go into a public cloud environment, but this is less, these have less requirements for compliance or security or manageability. Ideally, they want to do both. So when something moves into a public cloud environment, they want to have visibility into what's happening. How secure is it? Is it still meeting compliance? Can they bring it back easily? And can they take it from one public cloud vendor to another? So these are all the dynamics that have started becoming very real. If you look back at the analogy of the sourcing and the automation, so people want the flexibility to source it regardless of what type of cloud it is. So where we are going with this is something called as intercloud. And intercloud is really a network of clouds. It could be a private cloud, which the organization owns. It could be a public cloud. It could be a partner-hosted cloud. It really shouldn't matter. The key thing is to be able to take an application from a services catalog, which could be in a public cloud environment or a marketplace, and simply bring it into your private cloud environment and still have that ease of use. Where IT, based on what they want, they just bring it in and they have it deployed up and running. So this is where on one hand we're facilitating the openness between what the customer has on premise, and then affording a choice with a range of public cloud providers. And I talked about the ecosystem piece, right? So on one hand here, you don't want to compromise on security. On the other hand, you don't want to compromise on the ease of use that typical public clouds are meant to bring. So we're taking this concept again with the ecosystem approach as well. What started with our compute portfolio, we have a range of ecosystem partners there, solutions. We're extending to the network with ACI and then into the cloud. So the vision over the next several years is it shouldn't matter where the application workload resides. It shouldn't matter what type of application it is. It shouldn't matter how it is being accessed. The quality of experience needs to be very consistent, right? So that is the stage that we're trying to get into. And if you look at the past, there are some industry transitions that we have driven. One was in terms of bringing the storage, local area networking elements together. We call that as unified fabric. That mapped to that consolidation phase that I talked about, and we are number one in the industry since then. Next was bringing together this compute aspects, where we said, okay, let's take this a step further, bring the compute, network, storage access, and we make it policy driven so it's easier to consume. So that resulted in the Cisco UCS portfolio, which is the fastest growing blade server in the industry today, double-digit growth, 0 to number 2 in the industry in less than 5 years. And then we said, let's take the learnings from that policy-driven approach clicked with our customers. We said, why not apply this to networks? Because today the need of the hour is to make the networks as agile, as responsive to some of these applications' needs, automation. So we took that and now we've brought that to networks with the application-centric approach. And then taking all of these things together, making that as a resource pool, making it easy to consume across the cloud. So that's where the whole hybrid cloud strategy starts to kick in with intercloud. So net, if your data center is meant to service the needs of application, these are the things that we're doing over the next few years. And obviously, it is not an easy task to bring together these ecosystems, have these agreements with all the providers globally, because it's a globalized world. No other company is in a position to do what we're trying to do right now. It's a very ambitious task across the industry. So this is what I just wanted to land on and close this session. So in terms of what we want to do to modernize the data center, if somebody's had their data center for a few years, they're looking to sort of ramp up and say, hey, how do I move into this new world? We're saying, look, embrace these new models, embrace change. Don't shy away from change. Because the sooner you embrace change, sooner you consciously start to disrupt yourself, your IT organization, the less you're at the mercy of somebody else disrupting you. So there are newer organization models like DevOps coming, which is the combination of the development and the operational organization. We're saying empower them. Let's see what's good there. Second is policy. Cisco is banking a lot behind policy, and we think it's the next battleground in the industry in terms of the power of what it can do. So that's where it'll help dissolve some of the organizational silos, help with automation. Third is obviously bandwidth. We see a huge transition between 1 gig to 10 gig on the access side, but in the aggregation core, or depending on what architecture you have, it's going to get into 40 gig for the next couple of years very aggressively and moving to 100 gig. Then I talked about big data and analytics. It's very important to tie these together with the infrastructure components as well as the application elements, because if you can get that real-time correlation to what's happening with data in the organization, it really helps with the business decision making. And then hybrid cloud. So most organizations are still on the fence in terms of what should their cloud strategy be. I think we believe and we contend that the approach that we're taking right now is something that will give them choice. It will give them the ability to go take either or and still be in a very safe place, because this is not going to get into a lock-in scenario. It's giving them the flexibility to move. So eventually, if there's one takeaway, I think I would want to leave behind, it's that we're all about offering choice here, choice of deployment, choice of infrastructure model, or choice of consumption. So that is the one word that I would leave behind and say our promise is to go make the choice happen. And then obviously everybody has their own use case deployment requirement, and they can customize or adapt it as they require. All right, so with that, I hope this was useful, and we'll wrap and take some questions. Alex.
The old model did have one advantage. Scott McNeely calls it one throat to choke. If there's a problem, you know exactly going to go to fix it. As we progress into the future, responsibility seems to be becoming diffused among lots of parties, lots of players, lots of organizations. So what can we do to ensure that people are still responsive to get the problem solved, like in the old model?
I'll take a shot at it, and I'll invite a few other comments as well. See, the old model and I think the accountability issue, the one throat to choke, is not going to go away. If anything, I view the throat as growing bigger right now. It's a much bigger throat, because vendors like us, if I put that ecosystem slide as an example, we're actually taking accountability of not just integrating these solutions into a more unified offering, but also taking accountability for making it work, because we have pre-tested it, we have pre-integrated it, we're publishing design guides that show how you can deploy it in a much easier way. But also when something goes wrong, we're taking accountability for support. In the previous model, a customer would have had three throats to choke, because these were three different offerings. So there's a huge amount of focus where we're saying you can still go down the path of three different offerings. That's the choice aspect that I talked about. We'll support that. But we also recognize that us bringing things together, not just within our own portfolio, but amongst the different things, whether it's things up in the stack, not just the infrastructure going up the stack, whether it's across providers or across other vendors, and give you the same flexibility which you would have typically had with one vendor. It's a huge operational overhead that gets reduced. So I think the new model, if we do it right, there is an intent and then there is the execution. If we execute it right, if we bring it right, it's a win-win for everybody. And we're seeing a huge amount of traction from many of our competitors in the industry, because they say, look, Cisco is setting this platform up, they're opening it up, they have the traction, let's go partner with them, because it's a win-win for our joint customers. So they may be competing with us on one solution, but they're partnering with us on another. And that's the cooperative model that's on the ascent right now.